that phrase, conspiracy theorist, after the JFK assassination, was purposely designed so when anybody at that time of influence would say the government did it, they would immediately attack them. The media that existed at that time, they said use that phrase and just beat them about the head and shoulders and call them a conspiracy theorist. That has stuck in our lexicon here in this country. There's a savagery that comes out of the radicalization of the Islamic religion, if that's what you want to call it. I don't say it's a religion, okay? It's a political philosophy, and they use the idea of religion to mask that political philosophy. The idea that happened in Israel at that moment, and there was such a breakdown in security, a place that is the most secure border on the planet.
Makes no sense.
It doesn't. So when you look at it, you go, okay, what happened?
Let me welcome you back to Code Red. My name is Zach Terry, and I am your host. I'm very excited about today's episode. It will prove to be one of the most consequential episodes in the history of this podcast. Lieutenant General Michael Flynn joins us in the Code Red studio. We sat down without any barriers, without any restrictions. Everything was on the table. I could ask anything I wanted to ask, and we asked some very pointed questions about what's taking place around the world today, specifically at the intersection of faith and culture. So get ready, share this episode. You're going to want to see this Code Red. General Michael Flynn, welcome to the Code Red studio.
It's great being here, Pastor. How's everything going?
It's going amazing.
Good.
And you've really helped us out today. We've had a great luncheon with some of our key leaders in the community, and tonight, being at the church, we're looking forward to a great time there as well.
Yeah, what a wonderful group of people that was today. I mean, this, maybe a little description of this little town, because it's a beautiful place that we're at, and it's one of these, it's almost like you're lost back in time.
It's a time warp, for
it
sure,
really is. Just driving in here and very. It seems rural, but it's really not. There's a lot of people that live here, but it just has that rural feel to it, and it's a nice part of Florida that I don't get a chance to get up into.
Have you been here before?
I've been up in this part. My grandfather actually retired out of Jacksonville, which is not too far south of here, I guess, and there's Mayport State, stations here. Jacksonville, a Naval Air Station, that's where he retired out of. And so there's a lot of military up here, in this area generally.
Right.
But it's a beautiful area.
I know your background in military, coming through ROTC, commission there. Who are your heroes? You're a hero to many around the world, but who are your heroes in military service? Wow.
I think that I've studied different periods of war, and I've walked a lot of battlefields, actually. The era of warfare, even though I've studied Napoleonic era, and really going back to even before that. But I think the best period for me, which was really the most sacrifice in the United States, was the Civil War. And when I think about different general officers or certainly soldiers that fought, the ones that come to mind in that particular war was, of course, General Grant. And, General Grant, who then became the two presidents after Lincoln was assassinated. And Grant was a real tough guy and did not care about credit. He just, he was a very mission-oriented guy. And it took a long time because the war at that time, the Civil War in the United States, and we didn't have phones. We didn't have a lot of information moving as fast as it does today. So what Lincoln was aware of was a lot of the battles that were going on between really southern Pennsylvania to into Virginia and even down into South Carolina, because that information could get to Washington D.C. faster. Whereas Grant, at the time, in the beginning of the Civil War, was out on the western parts of the country. And if folks that want to look at a map can look up the Red River, and the Red River kind of splits Mississippi and Louisiana right down the seam, all the way down almost to the Gulf. And there was one of the big battles at that time was what's called the Siege of Vicksburg. And most Americans don't if they don't study it, you wouldn't know. But everybody knows the Battle of Gettysburg.
Right.
You ever heard of anything? In terms of warfare, you heard of the Battle of Gettysburg. Well, the Battle of Gettysburg was taking place over a long weekend, the 4th of July weekend, and at the exact same weekend was the Siege of Vicksburg. And the outcome of the Civil War was actually not decided at the Battle of Gettysburg. It was decided at the Siege of Vicksburg. Because once Grant broke the siege, he then marched across the South with a guy named Sherman. Everybody understands, down in the South.
We're not
right?
quite as fond of those guys.
Of course not. But it's fascinating. I know we're going to talk about a lot of things, but Sherman is another guy that I have a lot of respect for in terms of warfare and warfighting ability. But Sherman was also a really good writer. So he wrote a lot.
Really was.
And if you ever saw a picture of Sherman, you just think he's just a scruffy-looking guy.
Right.
But Sherman wrote a absolutely beautiful letter from the heart to the citizens of Atlanta the night before he then went in and attacked and like they say, he burned the city, right? But in the letter, and it's very short, you can look it up on the internet. In the letter, he talks about how difficult war is and that we cannot keep this thing going. And we're giving the people, the leadership of Atlanta at the time, giving you an opportunity to kind of join us, to say, hey, look, we've had enough of this war. We're going to keep the country united. Very articulate letter from a man who had been fighting, and I mean daily fighting for well over a year at that time, had bullets shot through him, to articulate such a beautiful, prosed letter in the middle of the night from his tent just on the outskirts of Atlanta, and the elders of Atlanta, they basically rebuffed him, and they didn't take it. And so he said, okay, well that's what happens in war. And then he then proceeded to take over the city of Atlanta, and he burned quite a bit of it. That part, when you think about soldiers and you think about where we are now, because I'm in the middle of doing things with our military now. All right, so for those listeners, I work with I'm working directly with the cadets at West Point, but also with Secretary Hegseth on some of the ideas that they're trying to promote when we talk about leader development and the future, not just future generals and sergeants and the leaders of our military, but future leaders of our country, because we move a lot of leaders of our country out of the military. They come out of the military, and so, when the sort of the people that I have a lot of time for and I've studied a lot, Grant would be right at the top of that list.
I can see that. Looking back in Sherman's writings prior to the war, because he had friends on both sides,
right,
and he made a very good argument for how bad this was going to be for the South, just because of they didn't have the structure, they didn't have the infrastructure that the North had. They didn't have the manpower.
That's
right. Like a 4-to-1 comparison, know. And now with you at West Point, all of those guys, the top generals came out of West Point.
Yeah, both sides.
Right.
Both sides.
I find it interesting. I know with your influence there at West Point, seeing every institution tends to drift to the left, it seems like over time. But did they still have, at one time they had a barracks that was named after General Lee. Is that still in place?
No,
Are you aware?
It's not. They have one there. I think it's theirs, the other one now. But no. In fact, that's the tragedy of this wokeism stuff that we're going through, that the nation's experiencing, is the idea that whatever happened in our history, if it was on something that in our country today the left doesn't appreciate or doesn't have some consideration of for what it did to influence or develop our nation, they want to get rid of it, right?
Right.
And that's one of the things. I mean, statues around the country, certainly at West Point, they also did some removal of statues. Places like veterans cemeteries, like the National Cemetery in Washington, D.C., the they did some removal of statues there too. It's just ridiculous. Now President Trump's back in, so he's made the demand that all that stuff gets
right.
Basically gets put back. But you can't deny your history. You just can't deny it. You can try to teach your what you believe your analysis of that history was, but you can't say it didn't happen. Right.
Well, and you're throwing away so much at the same time that, I think when Lincoln, as soon as the war was over, he had the band play Dixie to celebrate the culture of the South, that he said, now that's property of the federal government. That song belongs to the federal government. But that, just doing things that brought about healing in those early days,
That's something that our country is going to need now. And I think that we're going to face a period, because you're right about Lincoln, and sadly he was killed because of what he decided to do for the country. And there's I think there's a good analogy to what President Trump has also tried to do for the country, where we are today. And when you think about Lincoln, and then the guy, he's assassinated right at the tail end of the war, but back to one of the things that he wanted, and this is the real master of a person like Grant, who became the president. And so I think we're to try to keep this sort of analogy to where we are today, because our country is severely divided. Now, we're not divided by the Mason-Dixon line and North and South, but we're certainly divided by competing ideologies. And it's not like I can look at you and go, well, you're my enemy because you're from the North, you're from Maine or Massachusetts, or you're from South Carolina or Georgia. I mean, as you did in the Civil War. But I think what we are facing now is a ideological competition, and the ideological competition, and to bring it to where we are here today, Pastor, is this. I do believe that it is a competition of good versus evil, and those that are anti what I believe, and I'll just speak for myself as a person who believes in our country, who believes in being patriotic, who believes in the idea, I've been called a Christian nationalist, right? I'm called every name in the book, but one that I was called was a Christian nationalist, and I said, okay. So as I thought about it, I'm like, well, what's the opposite of that? Well, the opposite of that is a atheist, and globalist, I guess, right? So I would much rather be called a Christian nationalist, someone who believes in my faith and loves what I have learned to be is very good in life. And the other side is also loving my country, right? The nationalist side, right? And it's not like, because what they try to do is they'll try to say, well, nationalism, so you're you're a fascism, right? They'll try to pin that word on you, like they've tried to do that to the current president. But I think that this division it exists in every community, even in a beautiful community that we're in right now. Every single community is facing this. It exists in families. Families are being divided because, and I come from a large family. In my family, we do have some that are, they'll still argue with you about certain things, but they know they just got good common sense because we were raised right. So, but our whole family was raised. We were raised up in the Northeast as Democrats. So
we were as well.
I'm from a Democrat family, and at the time we were older, generation, I guess. But so we were like the JFK Democrats, right? We really appreciated a guy like JFK. Well, we just found out that our government, was responsible for killing the guy while he was president of the United States of America, right? I mean, how crazy is that? So this division that does exist in our country, I think that the way to overcome this, and that's why we're here, that's why I'm with you here today, is we have to bring our message, and it's really people like you, Pastor Jake, that you've got to bring this message of hopefulness and faith, but also of strength and discipline and courage. It's not just being hopeful and being faithful to your Christian beliefs, but it's also about being courageous and about being disciplined in executing that courage. It's going to take being courageous out there, whether or not you get involved in your community, whether you get involved in your church, whether you get involved in any walk of life. I mean, I think too many Americans have taken for granted too long the good things that we have, right? I mean, my mother and father, they're sort of World War II generation. My father fought in World War II and the Korean War, and they got married, after World War II, had a bunch of kids. But I think that, like, what they did was that whole generation worked really hard. We call it the greatest generation, right? And then, in the last couple of decades, we've tried to resurrect that term, the greatest generation, because of the wars that we're involved in over in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's not true. It's not a true statement. I mean, we have great people in our military, we have great people in our country, but that generation at that time, let's just say it was 75, 80 years ago, they actually came out of a very vicious war that could have changed the whole nature of the world. And what they decided to do is work hard and create this beautiful country. Our country really sprang out of World War II. Right. We came up from World War I a bit, where where without the American soldier going to Europe at that time, the outcome of that war would have been different. But we then went through a Great Depression. We went through a period of time where we really weren't sure kind of what our role in life was. The industrialization of the world was happening, and certainly in the United States. But World War II hit. The outcome was a success for the world, and the United States of America ended up helping to rebuild the world. And so now here we are. We are in another period, and I think it's I call it an existential period, where if we don't get through this, and I said earlier in our discussions at another event that you and I were at with some great people, that the idea of Christianity in this country, this is what our country was built upon. So our Constitution was built on a set of really Christian principles and values. I say Judeo-Christian principles and values because Judaism at the time did exist in the country and within our founders. And I just so happened to be from a town up in actually the next town over from where I grew up has the oldest synagogue in the country, Toro Synagogue. And so I've had an opportunity to go through it. I'm one of these kids, even as a kid, I was always interested in the history. We had a couple of old battlefields up there where the British fought during the Revolutionary days. So I would go study those things. But that when I think about our Constitution was built on a strong set of Judeo-Christian principles and values, and we should be fearless about those. The Christian church, and that's a big, broad umbrella, whether Catholic, evangelicals, Episcopalian, Methodist, Presbyterian, whatever the denomination is in the Christian doctrine and in the Christian traditions, that body has taken for granted the freedoms that we have. And I think that's where we have made an error in sort of our collective judgment, because we've just felt like, well, if somebody comes to me, political person, says, I'm a great Christian, I believe I'm going to do these things, you see them at your church, maybe they're in the front pew. But for 40 years, we had the Roe v. Wade amendment that was passed by the Supreme Court of the United States, and whether you want to get down this road or not, but we need to, because in our Constitution, in our Declaration, we declare that three things: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You can't have the latter two without the exactly. Verse 1. So for 40 years we were killing babies and that's because the Supreme Court of the United States of America in 1973, they got it wrong. It was an unconstitutional ruling, and just recently being the last year, I don't know how long ago it was, about a year ago now, I guess, they overruled it. They overturned a ruling that was in fact unconstitutional. So for 40 years, we as a nation of principally Christians, I think it's like the numbers right now are around 70% of our nation is still a Christian faith-based country. That doesn't mean that they all practice.
They identify as
but they identify as. And so we were for 40 years. So you're going to tell me that all of those political people, and like I said, I was a Democrat. I'm a Catholic. So for those 40 years, all those people serving in politics, all those Christians that were going to Washington, D.C., every single election, they couldn't turn this thing over. They could. They absolutely could. But they made a conscious decision because we let them. We, the people, allowed it. And we would argue about it. You could talk about it in the churches. I heard about it all as a kid growing up, right? It was a big, big deal in my house and in my neighborhood and in our church. But nobody ever did anything about it. So to me, that's part of the forgetfulness of the American Christian to not make a decision about, well, am I going to take a stand about something? You have to.
We recently received a letter here at Maximum Life from one of our listeners. They write, Pastor Terry, I was so discouraged about my Christian walk. I was not doing what I should be doing, and I was getting very depressed, starting to doubt my salvation. And that's when I heard Maximum Life. I went to the cross and confessed my sins, and that burden was lifted. And that's why we exist here at Maximum Life, to bring encouragement, truth, and hope through the gospel to people when they need it the most. If you would like to help us to continue sharing Christ with people just like this listener, we would be so grateful for your support. You can give securely online at zachterry.com/donate. Or, if you prefer, you can send a check to Maximum Life, P.O. Box 17226, Fernandina Beach, Florida, 32034. Every gift that you send helps us to change lives for eternity. So from all of us here at Maximum Life, thank you for standing with us in the gospel. It seems like, when Roe versus Wade was overturned, I was shocked, and I would say that I'm pretty optimistic generally. I'm get engaged in the process, but I really didn't believe in my lifetime we would see that. So when it happened, it kind of showed us that times are changing. We're in a new era. Yeah. Speaking of the Civil War, with Lincoln's election, there was a statement, and it may have been Sherman. You would probably know this better than I would, where we have two options: ballots or bullets. And generally, we as Americans, we want to fight with ballots. Right. We would rather fight with ballots. But in recent days, there's a lot of questions on the legitimacy of our elections.
Yeah, think about that. Think about this last 4 years, okay? So what's going to, and I don't know when this will play, but what will come out here very soon is just like we have seen with the whole Russiagate affair, this tragic, sad. Actually, it breaks my heart that our country actually has experienced that. So the election of 2020, and actually what they're going to find is they're going to discover that it's been happening even before that. But this election report and then the exposure of what has occurred in our country that will come out now that we have people in office who are actually looking at it fairly, and they're saying, look, these things happen, so I don't care what side of the aisle politically you stand on. Here it is in black and white. That doesn't lie, right? That's this guy said this to this guy and said we're going to do this, right? Which means undermine, usurp, do things that are totally against what our Constitution dictates. So that report and additional information is going to come out about the 2020 election. And so if let's just assume that what that report has is so detrimental to our constitutional system of government and our rule of law, and we actually did undermine and have a stolen election. And for 4 years, we had a illegitimate president who wrote a bunch of executive orders, and we did a bunch of things as U.S. citizens. They allowed in, untold illegals into our country. They allowed the destruction of our cities and our just the increase of crime, and not necessarily because of the illegals, that was part of it, but because this whole, tying the hands of our police forces out there, our first responders. I mean, so many egregious acts. Things like our economic system. So our economic system almost collapsed. It almost collapsed the last couple of years. When we just think about smaller things like something I'm very familiar with are pardons, right? So President Biden, right? President Biden, if he was legitimate, he actually gave more pardons than all other presidents combined, plus some.
Wow.
So over 8,000 pardons.
Wow, I wasn't aware of that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's unbelievable. 8,000 pardons, and they're looking at
and
these.
And what was it, Fauci, in case he did anything else we don't know about?
Anything. I mean, well, and people that actually were never even accused of a crime, he gave pardons to, like the January 6th, the fake committee of January 6th. So over 8,000 pardons. The next highest in presidents in our history would be Barack Obama. And I think his number is around 1,400. So, I mean, you can, and then all the others combined, they won't get to where Joe Biden was. So something was not right about that entire presidency, and we all know it. The American people, and this gets back to the church, the American people, and particularly Christians, they don't want to believe that somebody can be that bad.
No,
that evil can be that corrupt.
No,
right?
I didn't believe it, honestly, when everything first happened and Biden was declared president. Some dear friends in the church, some older gentlemen that have been studying this for a long time, we were having a conversation, and I told one of them, I said, do you really believe the election was stolen? And they said, absolutely. And at that point in time, I'm not by nature a conspiracy theorist because of what you're saying. My heart is generally to trust people.
Yeah. But
that's changing.
Well, John, so the phrase conspiracy theorist, if you don't know, and your audience may or may not know, some of them probably do. That phrase, conspiracy theorist, is a phrase after the JFK assassination. What the CIA did at that point in time is they developed and we now know this. This is not me making this up. This has been known for a long time. This was not one of the things that we recently discovered with the exposure of some of the more classified information that's been held for decades. But the phrase conspiracy theorist was purposely designed so when anybody of influence at that time after the Kennedy murder, anybody at that time of influence would say, the government did it. They would immediately attack them. The media that existed at that time, the mainstream media, as we now know, a lot of people call it the fake news media. But at that time, they said, use that phrase and just beat them about the head and shoulders and call them a conspiracy theorist. And that has stuck.
Right.
That has stuck in our lexicon here in this country. So if I say the 2020 election was stolen, right? Well, there's no proof. There's no evidence. How many times do we hear the media say, there's no evidence, there's no evidence? There's tons of evidence. And sadly, and they won't do it, though. This is where, again, this is back to the good versus evil. So those that are evil will never admit it. And they will not say they're sorry. They're not going to come in and go, well, geez, I really made a mistake. I mean, we'll give back our Pulitzer Prizes. The political people that are on the left, I mean, Jamie Raskin, I think it was today or the last 24 hours, Jamie Raskin, a congressman, said that, he talked about the crime in America because Trump has deployed, President Trump has deployed military forces to Washington, D.C. And, and there's some discussion about, well, maybe because they've reduced the crime there, maybe we should do it in other cities where people are just being murdered left and right. And Jamie Raskin had the gall to say, well, crime happens everywhere, that we have to almost accept it. And I'm those are my words, but those are pretty close to what I read about what he said. And I'm like, that's typical. That's typical of somebody who is a hardcore socialist who looks at things in a completely different way than I look at them. Then I would say most Americans look at it. No, you have to have a rule of law in a country other than what you were hinting at earlier. Otherwise, you end up with anarchy.
Right. And
we don't want that. We have a great, beautiful, beautiful document called the Constitution. We have a Declaration of Independence that takes about 3.5 minutes to read. We got a Bill of Rights that's based on the Bible itself. It's actually, the Bill of Rights is actually based on the Ten Commandments. Most people don't know that. 75% of the Constitution is derived from the Bible. Most people don't know that. They just think that, it was the founders and they just created it on a 3-day weekend. The Ten Commandments are promises that we make to each other, just like the Bill of Rights are promises that we make to each other. And that's what the founders talked about. What are the principal promises that we must make to each other? What are we going to give to our legacy, to whatever comes after us, right? So things like the freedom to practice your religion, to express yourself, right? That's the First Amendment, right? The Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, all these different things that were promises that were made. And what they argued about in many of the Federalist Papers and many of their own papers, they argued about different aspects of it, but they would always go back to the Ten Commandments and to the Bible. And what did it say at that time? So actually, those promises, like the Ten Commandments, are promises. The fulfillment of those promises of the Bill of Rights, the fulfillment is the Constitution. The fulfillment of the Ten Commandments is the Bible. Mm. And that's where, again, the people in this country have to understand that for the Christians, and Christians, other denominations argue with me about Mary, right? They don't believe in Mary, the concept of Mary, And I'm like, well, look, what's the doctrine that you read? So if you're going to pick up a manual, and you're a Christian, you're going to pick up a manual. What's the manual you're going to read? It's called the Bible, right? It's called the Bible. There's different versions, and there's different books within the Bible, but you're going to pick up the Bible. That's called doctrine. That's doctrine. That's a system of beliefs because that's who we are. The traditions that each denomination practices are different. They're going to be different. It's like, do you take a host, kneeling down in front of a priest, or do you give it to yourself? I mean, just little traditional things that makes us a little bit different. But actually, the most important thing is that we're unified under the Word of God. And to me, so the Christian church, if we're going to survive as a nation, and I mean this with every fiber of my body, if we're going to survive as a nation, the one component of our nation that must unify, and that's the Christian church. It's the church.
It's so important. I think from the study of history that nations, as they've survived, as they've flourished, they've had a common enemy and they've had a common point of worship. So we may differ on some of the minutiae of doctrine, but our common point of worship as the Judeo-Christian deity, the triune God, has given such strength to our nation over its history. And we've, in recent days, with that globalist attempt to erase that history and to erase our national sovereignty, they've tried to give us, erase the point of worship. And then secondly, produce a common enemy that is in common with every other nation of the world, whether that's COVID or whatever it may be. It's not us against them, but it's the world against a common enemy. Mm-hmm. And so seeing those two things, I've watched it in my lifetime in the last 5-10 years, taking God out of the public square, taking God out of the schools, and then saying, rather than us having national borders and national enemies, it's international, it's global, whether that's, diseases like COVID or whatever it might be. And there's something behind that. There's a force behind it.
It's imposed by man. So you hit a couple of key points there. And just as a little sidebar, we have our Pledge of Allegiance, because you talked about taking like prayer out of schools and stuff like that, right? Because public schools used to have prayer. Depends on which community you're at. Maybe some rural communities still do that, but which would be a good thing. But like our Pledge of Allegiance, which is an interesting document and an interesting statement of our love of country, our Pledge of Allegiance, right, to the United States. When you go through those 31 words, there are two that took a long time for our country to add in, right? And that's under God. They weren't added in until 1954.
Why was that, I wonder?
Well, and it took an act of Congress. And I think when you think about first of all, if you really look at the history of the Pledge of Allegiance and where it was derived from post the Civil War, there's some debate about the original writing of it and exactly who wrote it, but it was created, and then it developed time because there was a sense this is again trying to unify the country, right? And it became a prayer, if you will, that could unify the country because it taught children. If you were taught as a young child, I pledge allegiance to the flag, and you're pledging to this country. So you're pledging something, right? You're pledging yourself to the country. But the speed that then moved the world and where we're going, because we probably ought to touch a little bit on artificial intelligence. But the word that I wrote down, and I think that maybe, I don't know what your audience listens to, in terms of other things or reads about, is this idea of transhumanism. Okay? So we got globalism, we got all these isms, right? The belief in something, ism, right? It's a belief in something. So transhumanism. So trans means to change, human is human, right? And then ism is the idea or the belief in that, right? So the belief in changing humans, right? So there are people, and they've been working on this a long time. And these are not stupid people. These are smart people. And you're foolish to think that they have God at the center of their lives, because if they did, they wouldn't be really focused on these things to the degree that they are. So these are people that want to change the human being, right?
And genetically, or what are you speaking of?
Everything, every way. I mean, with inserting like Elon Musk talks about Neuralink. Connecting machine-human interfaces, right? The use of artificial intelligence. Now, if you were to tell me that, okay, can we use some of these adaptations, some of these innovations to help somebody who's been sitting in a wheelchair their whole life? Can we get them to stand? Because we can reconstruct, the neurons in your spine, right? Or maybe we figure out how to take the eyeball and replace it or recreate it inside and make somebody who could not see, right, see again. So, I mean, there's some things where you can kind of look at it and you go, wow, you really wouldn't want to do that? I mean, if we could do that, is that only a God thing? Does that only happen when miracles occur? Or is the miracle the actual innovation itself, right? The fact that God gives somebody enough of a brain power to be able to figure that out, because we are moving into a different world here, and it's going to be in an era that you and I are alive in. This is not talking about something that's in the next century. We're talking about something that's going to happen in the next 5 years here. So,
what you mentioned Musk. We've talked a little bit about Soros and the One World kind of movement. Who are the key players that you would be concerned about in the transhumanism?
Yeah, I would say that there's some doctors out there. An interesting one who I think he's on the right side is Malone, who became very famous with the whole COVID. He was one of the guys that he came out on against what was happening, but he was actually one of the early developers of some of the different vaccines. Certainly Elon Musk, Peter Thiel is one. He's been actually speaking quite a bit about it lately. The World Economic Forum crowd, Klaus Schwab, he's still the sort of the titular head, but he's not doing well health wise. So whatever they're doing, it ain't helping him. There's an interesting character by the name of Yuval Noah Harari. I don't know if that name rings a bell.
I've heard the name.
But he's a historian, Jewish guy, educator from Israel, and he seems to be their spokesperson. But he's also, he's a genius level guy. He's actually written a couple of books. One of them is called Sapien, and it's probably one of the most read books on the planet.
Right.
So I think it's like over 40 million copies sold. You read it, and you kind of go, okay, so this guy's talking about some real. He's talking about the rise of evil, okay, not something that is going to be better for humanity. People like Bill Gates, right? That's another name. There is a corporate structure to this as well, and there is a hierarchy out of, like when you hear things like the Bilderberg crowd, there's other groups that exist that are, these are not conspiracy theories. These are real groups, real people. So that body, though, that globalist body, which has its headquarters in Switzerland. So when you think about organizations like the World Trade Organization, World Bank, World Health Organization, International Monetary Fund, so those are things that matter to every single human being on the planet. Health, your finances, right? Nations and people to be able to trade freely if you create something. The International Monetary Fund, the kind of money that we are going to use, or that, all this stuff about cryptocurrency, right? All these new things, these new ideas, digital currency, central bank digital currencies that's kind of the Chinese model. And it's also a model that's happening in many places in Europe right now. So those are things that aren't just over there that happen to this globalist elite. These are things that are going to impact every single human being on the planet, and especially in developed nations. So like in the West, let's say Europe and the United States, certainly out in the Pacific, in places like Korea, Japan, countries down in South America, most of the countries now in Central America that are developed. So if they're going to dictate, they being this globalist leadership, because they do want to control these nations. So when you think about somebody like Macron over in France, who he may be out in another month, I'm told. His party may collapse. Right, his presidency may collapse, I'm told, as early as the first or second week of September. So we'll see what happens. But these are globalists, right? Starmer in the UK, members of this globalist element. They are part of the globalist system of beliefs. So what does that mean from a Christian's perspective? That means that they don't believe in God. If they sit there and they tell you, or they go walk into some church to fake pray. That's exactly what they're doing. They're doing it to gain favor from people who aren't paying attention. And then what they do is they bombard with the various propaganda machinery that does exist. We have it right here in this country. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard, good enough for her. We've known it for many, many decades, what's called the Mockingbird media. And the Mockingbird media was actually a strategy by the U.S. intelligence community, led by the CIA, decades ago. Actually, it comes out of World War II and into the 50s and 60s, where the Mockingbird media would basically come up with a stream of consciousness of what they wanted to propagandize the American people to believe. Vietnam War is a perfect example of it. Everything's rosy. And then just constantly, every single night, beat that drum. Put it in the headlines of the major newspapers in the country, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, LA Times. Just constantly, put it out there in front of everybody in the papers of the day, in the news media of the day, and you that's what you believe, because you think they said it must be true.
Hey guys, I want to personally invite you to join us for a very special evening, our annual Maximum Life Celebration Dinner. This is more than just a meal together. It's an opportunity to hear from our heart about the vision God has given us for this ministry. You'll get a first-hand look at the ideas and the initiatives that we will be launching this year before anyone else hears about them. And of course, you will enjoy some wonderful food, some fellowship, and be surrounded by like-minded believers who share the same passion for seeing lives change through the power of God's Word. God is opening some incredible doors for Maximum Life, and we believe that this evening will be both encouraging to you and will help us step forward together into all that He has planned. The details are available right now at zachterry.com/events, and that's also where you can reserve your spot. I hope you will join us for this special night of vision, fellowship, and celebration. We cannot wait to see you there. Well, and I think that's why media formats like this are so important,
Right.
Because we don't get those talking points. We get up and we talk about what's on our mind.
Right.
Speaking of, we were in Israel when October 7th took place.
Wow.
So we were on the Sea of Galilee. As soon as we got off the boat, we had 50 some odd of our people touring, doing the historical tour there. And I remember the day before, the streets of Tel Aviv were filled with people protesting against Netanyahu.
Mm-hmm.
It happened. Our tour guide, an Israeli, I said, you know, what's behind this? And the first thing he said is, I think Bibi let it happen. First thing he said. I hadn't thought about that in quite some time until I read a tweet of yours recently where you said this did not seem to be coincidental, and some information has come out where they told troops to stand down and that sort of thing. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, I've been to Israel quite a bit for a variety of reasons, and worked with the Israeli intelligence and Israeli military, and I have been pretty much on their entire border. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I've walked the entire border, but I've walked big chunks of it, or certainly been down to it, and I have studied it, and I have been presented, what they do at a certain place, at a certain junction, in a certain surveillance site. So I've been physically there, and I've done it for the better part of a couple of decades.
How much of their Iron Dome did we contribute as far as the intelligence behind it?
Oh, I would say, I'd say probably better part of, I'd almost say 100%.
Well, I was in
honestly,
Huntsville, and the Redstone Arsenal guys up there always told me that.
Yeah, I would say 100% of it. I mean, certainly the capability, the linking from it to satellites to the constellation. So there's a lot of technical stuff there, but that thing wouldn't function without the United States of America. But the 7th of October, to me, the period of time from, I think it was around 4:30 to about 9 o'clock, in the morning, and there was that, the celebration going on. There had to have been a conscious decision to stand the military down at that point. Okay, there's a little town down there called Ashkelon, and then there's the way that Gaza kind of swings back around and then runs really to the west. They had to have been given, and what I understand is that there was an order to stand down. Because I actually called for the day after. I called for the commander to, and probably the head of intelligence, I think, if I'm not mistaken, to be removed immediately and to be investigated, not to just be fired, but to be investigated, because that happened. There's no way, and I will never believe it. And I only because I have sort of been there and I know what their rules of engagement are. I know what their system of, how they run their security operations are. I just know a lot about it. So now the question is why, right? So let's assume that there was a stand-down order for a number of hours, and the real tragedy began. I mean, you're talking about some really brutal things in it. And I think we still have 50 hostages or so that they're holding. So the question is why? Why was it? And a lot of people that'll listen to this part will, was it drawn? Were they drawn in, or were they drawing in the United States of America into a bigger war? Right? Were we trying to be drawn in? Was the Israeli government under Netanyahu? Were they drawing in the U.S. to have to get to kind of return, right? To come back into the Middle East, or was, like we've seen, the Israelis have done a masterful job of taking out the leadership of Hezbollah, Hamas, and even Iran. But we did get drawn back in. We got drawn into something that I know that President Trump didn't want to get drawn into. And eventually, what the United States had to do was to take action against their Iranian nuclear capabilities, right? So would that have happened had that October 7th event not occurred, right? Where would we be with the development of the Iranian nuclear capabilities. I'm totally against that. I've been against it for well over a decade now. But the idea that happened in Israel at that moment, and there was such a breakdown in security, a place that is the most secure border on the planet,
makes no sense.
It doesn't. So when you look at it, you go, okay, what happened? And I can tell you, and I could probably figure it out if Netanyahu said, Flynn, come on in and take a look at it. We're going to open up everything. I could figure that out in about 24 hours. Because all you got to do is you got to get down and grab the company commanders that man those infantry locations along that secure part of their border, and you bring them in and you ask them to be honest. And if they're honest, they're going to tell you, now we were told to stand down. Well, and some of that information is coming out. It's
difficult from a Christian perspective because our eschatology leads us to be supporters of the Israeli.
Right.
We're Zionists generally, as evangelicals at least, and we've been behind Israel. We've considered them, one of our top allies and all that for so many years. It's difficult for us to ever be critical of anything that takes place over there from a Christian perspective. But
otherwise, you'd be called an anti-Semite.
Exactly.
I've been called that.
Yeah, and it's
I've been called pro-Jew, anti-Semite, whatever the opposite are.
Whatever's new today.
So here's the challenge for you, okay? For the believers. And it's like, it's the old adage, I guess. There's a sin, and you don't have to like the sin. You like the
love the sinner, hate the sin.
Love the sinner, hate the sin, right? Okay. So was a sin committed, right, by a human being? Or by a small group of human beings? Was a decision made to allow this to occur? Okay, to cause a second, third, fourth, fifth order consequence, right? In warfare, you have an action, you have a reaction, and then you have a counteraction. So these things are very thought through. These are not mistakes that were made. This was not a mistake. So it was not a mistake. The preparation of those forces that attacked into southern Israel at that time on October 7th were so well prepared, and it was a masterful stroke of it was almost a military genius level type stroke, right? When you think about it. So how did that happen in a place where we all go, the Mossad, Israelis, they got great intelligence, they got the best intelligence in the world. Really? I don't think so. Okay, so if I believe that their intelligence failed, that they had a complete meltdown, then that's why it happened. I don't believe that, because the border was unsecure. That border is the most secure border on the planet. So something happened. So now you look at it and you go, as a Christian, you go, look, I totally believe what you just said, Pastor, about our relationship with Israel. Okay. And one of the things that I have said that is Israel is in the Bible, and the people of Israel, is a place and human beings, and as Christians, will always have a relationship with them. And I'm Israel's number one fan, because I will go, and I have done many things for the Israelis over a long period of my career to make sure that they didn't have to do it. Okay, so I put my life on the line with many others, so they didn't have to do it, right? To protect what they needed, because it is a bastion of freedom and democracy in a cauldron of evil, pure, unadulterated evil. Amen. It is they can say what they want about the different countries there and the kings and the princes and everything, but deep down, there's a savagery that comes out of the radicalization of the Islamic religion, if that's what you want to call it. I don't call it that. I don't say it's a religion. Okay, it's a political philosophy, and they use the idea of religion to mask that political philosophy, right? I mean, I talked earlier about canon law, Sharia law. They don't practice anything but Sharia law. I wrote a book a while back, and I studied how many books actually were written in a variety of nations. I think it was like 22 nations. So how many books were written in the last, X number of years, like the last year, right? And it was none. And then I said, let's go back 10 years. It was none. Because you're not allowed to write any other books in that society. okay? Because there's only one book, and that's called the Quran, right? And so, and it's Hadith system. It's kind of like they're the sort of the Bill of Rights, if you will, right? So I actually look at this thing and I'm like, okay, I can condemn the decisions that I think were made by the Netanyahu government, because I do think that there were some poor decisions that were made initially, and it's difficult. They had to do something. And I don't mind, and I'll challenge Bibi Netanyahu.
Well, I appreciate that about you. We talked about it some today at the luncheon. If Trump's in the wrong, then somebody needs to be able to say something about it, and to be able to do that without changing your principles is very, very important.
The thing that, and because we just getting to know each other, and I appreciate this conversation. The one thing from my perspective, and I will, if I am challenged on something, and it's like I think I'm out there on the left field, I'll go back and I'll research it and get myself right about it, and I'll admit it. But when I say something, I believe what I say, and I say it based on my experiences and my own personal study of the things that I have had, I've gone through in my own life. And so, I'm not going to talk about Namibia, or I won't talk about Uganda, or certain places, the things that, because those are not places that I would consider myself knowledgeable on. But that part of the world,
you know what you're talking about.
I know what I'm talking about.
Well, you said today in the luncheon, you mentioned that if New York gets a Islamic mayor, that he will put a mosque on Ground Zero. Yeah,
I mean, you're going to see prayer rugs all over Ground Zero. And they're not going to be praying for the souls that were killed on that day, on that fateful day. They will not. It's a very fascinating time. And so people that are living down in these little, urban, these little rural, suburban, places in the rest of the country, here we are in this beautiful little town. But, I've been all over the country. You can't go, well, that's New York City for you. No. This is this is a dangerous moment. Very dangerous moment.
Well, but what you said is spot on. And I remember in Israel, we were told that's been a method of Islam from long ago, that they like to put the mosque up on holy sites, or sites where great historic events have happened. And what happens in New York, it's going to come downstream eventually. It's going to affect the rest of it.
The destruction of Christian churches wherever the sort of the Islamic community raises its head, they just start destroying things. When you think about, let's just, let's go down this path a little bit. Are Muslims rushing to Saudi Arabia, or rushing to Yemen, or rushing to Egypt, or rushing to Libya to get away from something? No, where are they going? And so are they going, they're going into the West, right? They're going into Europe. They're going into all of Europe. Right, they're coming into this country. I mean, millions illegally came into this country over the last 4 years that are Muslims, as well as a whole bunch of other people from different countries. I think 174 countries. There's only like 190 countries on the planet. So, I think what we have to look at is, what is the behavior and what is the action? I think I said in that room about rapes in the United Kingdom. I mean, rapes in the United Kingdom are just so out of control. They're out of control all over Europe. I'm going to try to, while I'm sitting, I'll try to pull up the numbers, because it blew me away when I saw it the other day, and I'm like, God, how can we allow this?
Of Islam, the pedophilia in some of the Ottoman Empire. People don't know about that. It's kind of one of those things we can't talk about, but it's some very perverted stuff that's taking place in that movement.
So let me, because I wrote, and the world of information, right? I wrote a post the other day on X, and I wrote it in response to a guy who I know, Tommy Robinson, who's an investigative journalist over in England, and he wrote on top of a post. And it's just, these are reported rape statistics across Europe. Okay. Poland, which doesn't have, did not allow illegals and does not allow, Poland is like 95% Catholic. Okay. So here's some stats for you. These are rapes. Poland, 590. Denmark, 2,831. Spain, 2,870. Belgium, 4,600. Italy, 5,000. France, 38,094. Britain, United Kingdom, 73,000 rapes. I mean, these are epidemic numbers. The more you, and what you have to do now is you look at, because what they lay out is you look at the rise of Islamism in those countries. And it's out of control. It's absolutely out of control. And so my questions were there, like, where are all the feminists, right? Because they also exist over in Europe. Because what happens and what is happening is this shift, this global shift that's taking place. It's actually going to occur in our country, okay? Because it is
how close do you think if we do not rise up and do something to turn the tide? What would you say? Are we a decade away?
It's a math problem. It's a math problem, and the reason why I say it's a math problem because when you think about the birth rates, because you have to consider birth rates, and it's also the sort of the culturalism, right? What's our culture here in America? We want people to come in here and assimilate and become Americans and love the country. Follow the rule of law. Read the Constitution, right? I mean, and assimilate into a population that allows for all these great freedoms and thrive, right? Innovate. We're still a very innovative country. If you can come up with an idea and you can develop it, you can become very wealthy and you can have a lot of success, right? All these different things that our country gives us. But the math problem is, two sides of an equation, right? Or two sides of an equal sign. And on one side, let's just say you pose the Christian community. The Christian community in our country right now is having children at about, I think the last number that I read was about 1.2, 1.3 children per Christian family.
Right.
Okay, 1.2, 1.3. That actually has come down from the 2010 census. There was a 2020 census as well, but the 2010 census had us at about 2.8, okay, children per family. Now we're closing in on one child per family. Okay. The other side, so the Muslim side predominantly, and you can look at other like the Hispanic culture, but really the Muslim side, when you start looking at the Muslim communities in our country, which are relatively small, we're still absorbing them coming into our country from various parts of the world. But they're having children at the rate of about, it's really somewhere between 4 to 8 and 6 to 10 per woman. So at a certain point in time, it's no longer equal. One side is greater than the other. So, is it 4 years? Is it 8 years? Is it 16? Is it 30 years? How many years is it until we kind of look around and go, geez, we've really changed, right? I mean, when you look at the demographics in our country for African Americans, for Hispanics, for Chinese Americans, for Serbian Americans, for, you name it, right? You go down the list. And we actually, as a nation, we're proud of that. That's we're a nation of immigrants, right? And so we're proud of that idea. But we're also proud of people coming in and going, I'm proud to be an American.
Right.
I'm not going to come in and say, nope, I don't like your law. I don't like your flag. I don't like, the way you're telling me to live. I want to live where women are subservient, because they are. Actually, in the Middle East, there are some countries in the Middle East that treat their animals better than they treat their women, because they're considered property, not considered a human being. They're considered a piece of property to be owned. So, I mean, are we moving in that direction? Is that what the American people want? Because if we keep voting for the people that we have in our political life right now, who are really, they tend to be some of the weakest people that we have. And I mean, I don't know how else to say it, because they're either cowards or they're so stupid and incompetent, and then they just keep voting for things that just don't help the country.
Never take a stand.
Ever.
Right.
Ever.
Well, the thing that I appreciate about the crusade that it seems like you're on right now, to get the information out and call people to think differently. What we have is worth fighting for.
Mm-hmm.
What you and I have inherited from our forefathers is worth fighting for, and it's governmental, it's cultural, but it's something that we deeply love, or we used to,
Right.
and it's worth fighting for. And if we don't recognize what's taking place around us, we'll wake up one day and our nation will be gone.
Yeah.
Whatever the time frame is.
What caused a very small percentage of, principally of men, but their families certainly, but what caused a very small percentage of people at the founding of this country, when it wasn't a country, it was known as colonies, right? They were British colonies. They couldn't, the roads weren't great. There was no communications like we have today. So they couldn't like pick up a phone and go, somebody from South Carolina call up somebody up in Boston and go, hey, are you guys getting together today? Like the Battle of Lexington, right? So what caused a small percentage, and it was actually about around 4% of the population that actually fought during the Revolutionary War. What caused those people to say, enough is enough? I'm willing to take up arms,
right?
Knowing, every one of our founders knew that they were going to lose everything. They all knew. Washington, he actually wrote about it. They knew that they were going to be hung, shot, whatever. All of them knew that, and a lot of them lost their wealth anyways. They all gave, they gave up a lot to have something that they would never see. God, talk about faith, right?
And the concept of manifest destiny that's kind of laughed at today,
right.
that drove those people, that they believed that there was something that God was doing here,
right?
That was unstoppable.
Because this is probably it's an area you're I figure you're an expert, but faith, right? So they had a dream or a vision or something, a manifestation, where they could see something together that they would never see. Okay? And they saw it. But they saw it together. And they knew they would never see it. Now, maybe some of them survived into the early part of the next century, into the early 1800s. A few of them did, But they were never going to see it. And they didn't really know what it was. In fact, they called it an experiment.
Right.
They called it an experiment. To me, that's like, if they had that kind of bravery, that kind of fortitude, discipline, leadership, vision, where are those people today?
Well, and that's what it's going to require.
Yeah.
We've got to have hope, courage, optimism, and believe that we can still preach the gospel of Jesus Christ and win people to the Lord, and we can build back something great again. General Flynn, thank you so much for coming on Code Red.
Absolutely. Thanks.